Hello and welcome to Business Law. My name is Kara Putman and I will be your instructor for Management 354/454. So welcome to the class. I'm very much looking forward to spending this next several weeks with you as we talk about the different areas of business law. Just to give you a little bit of background on me before we get started so you know why you should care that I'm the one teaching this class. I have my JD or my law degree from George Mason University School of Law, and I have my MBA from here at Purdue. I have been practicing law since I graduated in 2001, and I clerked for a federal judge, which I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into Chapter 2. So I have been teaching here at Purdue at Krannert since 2006, and I've been teaching business law since that time. I also teach a lot of other classes to graduate students here at Krannert. So now that you know a little bit about me, let's get started with business law. Now, this first chapter is going to give you an overview of where we find law here in the United States. Then we'll start moving into the structure of our court system before we start moving into ethics and then all of the different areas of law that we will cover during this semester. So to get started, where do we find our legal rights? Basically, one way to think about legal rights is that it's a balance. Normally, you're going to have a legal duty to do something, but at the same time, you're going to have rights that prevent other people from doing things to you. So, an easy way to think about this is most of you probably have a driver's license. When you get a driver's license, you accept the legal responsibility to follow all of the rules of the road. You can't decide today, I'm not going to stop at stop signs or I'm going to run red lights, because you have a legal obligation to follow the rules of the road. At the same time, other drivers have a countervailing duty to do the same thing for you. So when they see a red light, they have to stop so that you can then go through with the green light. So legal rights basically are the idea that you have the capacity, and we're going to talk about capacity a lot when we get into contracts, but you have the legal ability to require someone to do or not do something related to you. Another example of this would be, let's say we're halfway through the semester, you've had the first test or two, and you're just not liking the grade that you're receiving. Well, that's fine, but you don't have the legal ability to come and murder me because you don't like the grade that I'm giving you. The flip side of that is I can't murder you either because I don't like something that you're doing. So there's this right not to be killed, but there's also a duty not to kill others. So there's this give and take between rights and duties. So in addition, those rights are going to flow from the U.S. Constitution, things like freedom of speech, due process from the 4th and 5th Amendments, the right to vote in certain circumstances, you're 18, you're not a convicted felon, things like that. And the 4th and 5th Amendment can extend those to the right to privacy, the right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures by the federal government, and by extension through the 14th and 13th Amendments, state and local governments against you as an individual. Your rights are being protected by the Constitution from the invasion of the government. Now, these rights are constantly changing. It's just the nature of our law that there's always moving and shaking around the edges. So as we start looking at how the court systems are structured, you're going to see that the Supreme Court and other courts from time to time can come in and adjust where those rights, where those lines between the individual and the government actually exist. And Roe v. Wade and the line of cases, Griswold versus Connecticut, Doe versus Pennsylvania, there's a whole line of cases which have extended the right of privacy to protection against intrusion by others, not just the government. All right, so there's also this dynamic in the world we're living in right now where technology is constantly evolving and changing. Think how many times an iPhone has changed. When the iPhone 4 came out, you may have had that and thought it was the best phone that could ever exist. Then the iPhone 5 came out and the iPhone 6, and they're constantly updating and changing it. And that's just one example. Technology has an amazing turnaround time where there's new developments and things are improving and changing all the time. Well, one of the realities is that with technology, privacy rights and other rights change and shift. And sometimes the law has a hard time keeping up with those changes because the law moves very slowly. As we're going to see, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time to change the law. And so when it comes to things like technology, and it's going to relate not just to privacy, but to a lot of other areas, the law doesn't always keep up with how quickly things are evolving and changing. So where do we find the law? Private law is the law between individuals. So think about two businesses that are entering into a contract. We're going to spend a lot of time over the course of this semester talking about the contractual rights that you have and how you set up a contract. So private law, think contracts. Then there's case law, and this is where laws are made by different judges. And so courts are going to, from time to time, hear cases. They're going to write opinions, and when those opinions are published, that becomes case law that people can rely on in the future. So if the facts, if the law are similar to a current situation that you have, then those prior cases may apply directly to your situation. Then there are treaties and executive orders. Treaties are the laws that are created between countries. So the European Union was created by a treaty. The United Nations was created by a treaty. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Organization, was created by a treaty. So think, when you hear treaty, you think international law between two or more parties. Executive orders, on the other hand, are laws and regulations that the president adopts. So, for example, when we get into employment law, we may talk about Executive Order 11246, which is where the president has said, if you are contracting with the federal government and the amount of the contract is more than $10,000, then you have to have an affirmative action plan in order to qualify for that federal contract. There's no congressional law, no law that was passed by both houses of Congress that establishes this process. It is totally and purely coming from the executive branch and the president. And then we have uniform state laws. Now, when we get into the contract chapters, we're going to talk about the Uniform Commercial Code. And this is a great example of a uniform law. So in the United States, we have 50 different states, and those states can have different laws. But what has happened is over the last 100 years, different groups of legal scholars have gotten together and said that there are certain areas of the law where having a uniform or standard law that applies across states can be very, very helpful. So the Uniform Commercial Code is probably the most widely adopted of those. And essentially what happens is the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, establishes what happens in the sale of goods. So if I'm in Nebraska, Indiana, Texas, New York, they're all going to have a very similar law on what happens when there's a contract for the sale of goods of $500 or more. Next, let's look at classifications of laws. So when you're looking at substantive versus procedural law, there are two very different areas, and you need to understand those distinctions. Substantive deals with like the heart of the law. It's what tells us when there's been a tort or when there's been a crime. So it defines and kind of delineates the outlines of the different rights that you have, the rights and duties that you have under the law. Procedural law kicks in when you need to go before a court. And so it outlines how you gain access to the court, how you can get something kicked out of court through like a Rule 12b6 motion or a Rule 56 motion. It establishes the evidence laws, the appellate rules, all of those kinds of things that tell you how to actually access and take advantage of the courts are going to be delineated through procedural law. The Administrative Procedures Act would be another example of that, and it relates to the regulatory aspects of the law. All right, then there's criminal versus civil law. And one thing I want you to understand is when it comes to criminal law, only the government can prosecute a crime against someone. So this might be at the federal level with Department of Justice. It might be at the state level with the State Attorney General's office, or at the county level with a county prosecutor. And some cities are going to be big enough that they'll have city attorneys. But it's never going to be a private individual going against somebody for a crime. you can do it on the civil side, but not on the criminal side that leads to jail time. And then the civil laws define the rights of one person against another. So here's an example that might help you keep these straight. O.J. Simpson was accused of murdering his ex-wife and her boyfriend. So the state of California prosecuted him for the crime of murder. They failed because of the reasonable doubt standard. Then the families sued him in civil court for money, and they won because it's a preponderance of the evidence, so more like 50% plus one, believing that he had murdered them versus not murdering them. So there are different standards, and we're going to talk about all of that when we get into, I believe it's chapter 8 on crimes. Then there's law versus equity. Generally in the United States, we believe that money can make everything good. So if you can prove that there was a breach of contract, you're going to get money damages. If there was a tort, you're going to get money damages. Every once in a while, equity will step in and say that money alone is not going to make the person who is injured whole. So in those situations, and something like a preliminary injunction or injunctive relief will be offered, an order that you have to sell something because otherwise the person who is injured just will not be made whole. All right, so that's chapter 1. Now that you have an understanding of where the law comes from, we're going to look in the next video at how the court system breaks out.